Their cries were seldom heard, their names often forgotten. In the alleys behind monasteries, on the steps of cathedrals, and under the cold watch of castle walls, medieval orphans fought to survive in a world that offered them little mercy. Some were sold, others starved. A few were taken in, but not always out of kindness. This is not the story of kings or crusades. This is the story of the forsaken children of the Middle Ages, abandoned by fate, shaped by survival, and forgotten by history in medieval Europe. Childhood could end without warning. A single night of fever, a poorly aimed arrow, or a woman's final breath in childbirth could leave a child suddenly alone. Orphanhood was not a rare tragedy, was an ever-present possibility in a time shaped by relentless death. From the 11th to the 15th century, the threats were unyielding: plague, war, famine, and maternal mortality carved deep into the fabric of daily life. The Black Death alone extinguished nearly half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. In England, Florence, Paris, entire households were wiped out in weeks. Villages emptied. Children wandered among the dead, too young to understand, too old to ignore the silence. Chronicles from Siena describe infants crying next to their mothers' corpses. In some towns, there weren't enough living adults left to bury the dead, let alone care for the surviving children. Even in years untouched by pandemic, the risks remained constant. Famine was a cyclical spectre. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 struck across northern Europe with merciless reach. Livestock perished, crops failed, prices soared. In some areas of modern-day France and the Low Countries, reports of infanticide and cannibalism surfaced not as horror stories, but as desperate realities. When entire families starved, children were the most vulnerable. Those who survived without parents often had no memory of how they were left alone. War further fractured fragile lives. The 100 Years' War, which raged from 1337 to 1453, displaced entire generations. Soldiers trampled farmland, torched villages, and recruited the unwilling. Battles didn't just kill fathers. They burned down homes, destroyed economies, and left children with no way to survive. After massacres like those at Limoges or Cannes, orphans were not counted. They weren't named in treaties or honored in songs. Their suffering existed in the margins of official accounts. If it was recorded at all, maternal death during childbirth added to the toll. Across medieval Europe, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 births resulted in the mother's death. In poorer regions, that number could be higher. The surviving infants were often left in the hands of overwhelmed relatives, taken in by mothers, or abandoned outright. Without wet nurses or kin, many newborns didn't live long enough to be counted as orphans. Records from the time are patchy at best. Parish registers, tax rolls, and burial logs sometimes mention orphans, but more often, they vanish between the lines. They had no property, no inheritance, and no standing. Many were never baptized, never buried in consecrated ground, never mentioned in wills. Their stories flicker only through inference, through gaps in household lists or unexplained guardianships. The medieval orphan was not a central figure in chronicles. They were not mourned in epic poems or painted in frescoes. They existed in silence, in the spaces between wars and the footnotes of catastrophe. Yet they were many, invisible, yes but real, and their absence tells as much about medieval society as their presence ever could. In medieval Europe, abandonment was a decision shaped by desperation, poverty, and social pressure. It was not uncommon for infants, especially those born outside of marriage or into destitute households, to be left at the threshold of monasteries, convents, and parish churches. The practice was widespread across the continent by the 12th century and persisted through the late Middle Ages. These children were not lost by accident. They were cast aside, deliberately left in places where survival was possible, though never guaranteed. Mothers sometimes waited for nightfall before placing a newborn on the cold stone steps of a cloister. Some left notes, scraps of cloth, or religious tokens, objects that marked identity or origin, but also offered the faint hope of future recognition. In many cities, especially in Italy and parts of southern France, a more formal system emerged. The ruota dei trovatelli, or foundling wheel. This was a rotating wooden cylinder, often built into the wall of a convent or orphanage. A parent could place an infant inside, turn the wheel, and walk away without being seen. The system preserved anonymity and offered an alternative to infanticide, which, though illegal and condemned, was still a grim reality in desperate households. The foundling wheel became a common institution by the 14th century. In Rome, the Santo Spirito Hospital operated one of the earliest documented examples. In Florence, the Spedal degli Innocenti opened in 1445, designed specifically to receive and care for abandoned children. By the 15th century, similar systems had spread to cities like Milan, Naples, and Lisbon. These institutions became vital nodes in urban social care, but they were overwhelmed almost from the start. The reasons behind abandonment were varied. Poverty was a constant driver, particularly during periods of famine, plague, or social upheaval. Illegitimacy carried deep shame, especially for women. A child born outside wedlock was stigmatized, often denied inheritance, and could jeopardize the mother's social standing entirely. In many cases, leaving the child at a religious institution was seen not as cruelty but as a lesser evil, an act of relinquishment with the hope of salvation. The Church's stance on abandonment reflected the era's contradictions. While official doctrine condemned infanticide and urged compassion, the reality was uneven. Some monasteries received children and baptized them quickly. Others viewed the influx of foundlings as a burden, especially when resources were scarce. Public sermons occasionally railed against parents who cast off their own flesh, and yet few alternatives were provided. In some places, the act of abandonment was criminalized. In others, it was quietly tolerated. Not all abandoned children found shelter. In rural regions where institutions were absent, infants left at crossroads or riverbanks rarely survived. Abandonment in those settings often meant death by exposure. But where the Church had presence and the foundling wheels turned, a different outcome was possible, though far from ideal. Many children faced undernourishment, overcrowded dormitories, and high mortality rates within the institutions meant to save them. Medieval abandonment was not only a social issue, it was a mirror held up to the harshness of the time. The church doorstep became both a refuge and a similar place, where survival and silence met by the early 15th century. Europe's growing cities began to formalize what had long been an improvised response to abandoned and orphaned children. In Florence, 1445 marked the opening of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, the first purpose-built foundling hospital in Europe. Funded by the Arte della Seta, the powerful Silk Guild, and designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, the building was a symbol of civic pride and Christian charity. Its name, Hospital of the Innocents, evoked the biblical massacre of the innocents. casting these abandoned children as victims of circumstance worthy of rescue. The institution was not unique in purpose, but in organization. Its creation reflected a growing sense of civic responsibility, especially in Italian city-states, where wealth and social inequality existed side by side. Similar institutions soon appeared in cities like Milan, Venice, and Bologna, and by the 16th century, the model had spread beyond Italy in London. Early forms of childcare institutions existed under the Church's influence, but it wasn't until the 18th century that the city would establish the Foundling Hospital. In the medieval period, English responses to orphanhood were more fragmented, relying heavily on parish relief, monastic charity, and informal fostering. Institutions like St. Bartholomew's and St. Thomas Hospital did take in foundlings. But without dedicated infrastructure or resources, care was inconsistent and often temporary. Inside these institutions, life was regimented and austere. New arrivals were usually baptized and given new names, severing them from their past. Many hospitals adopted tokens buttons, scraps of fabric, or coins left by parents who hoped one day to reclaim their child. But the reality was harsh. Most children never saw their families again. Conditions within the hospitals varied. At the Ospedale degli Innocenti, infants were raised by wet nurses in the countryside before returning around age 5 to live in the hospital and receive basic education and training. Boys were often apprenticed by age 7 or 8, typically, into manual trades. Girls were trained for domestic service or, in some cases, placed into convents. Mortality rates remained high. In many institutions, up to half the children died before age 10, often from malnutrition, overcrowding, or infectious disease. Religious orders managed many of these facilities, and the moral framework of their care reflected prevailing theological views. Children were raised under strict discipline, expected to conform to religious instruction and obedience. Compassion existed, but it was bound by rigid hierarchies and resource scarcity. The aim was not emotional healing, it was social rehabilitation. Charity had its limits. In times of famine or war, hospitals turned children away. In others, they accepted them but failed to provide adequate shelter or sustenance. Some facilities became dumping grounds for unwanted children with no prospects of adoption or apprenticeship. Abandonment did not end at the door, it simply changed form. These institutions were never purely sanctuaries. They were systems of containment, designed to absorb society's unwanted but not always to transform their futures. For some, they offered structure and survival. For many, they were holding stations between rejection and a hard adulthood. Intention was mercy. The outcome was often something far more complex. By the age of 7, many orphans in medieval Europe were no longer considered children in any practical sense. In the absence of parents, their survival often depended on their usefulness. Institutions, guilds, and private households took them in not as acts of pure benevolence, but as transactions. In exchange for food, shelter, and a rudimentary education, orphans provided labor. The line between care and exploitation was thin, and often blurred by economic necessity. Apprenticeship was one of the most common outcomes for abandoned or orphaned children in cities like London, Bruges, and Florence. Guilds regulated trade and craftwork with strict hierarchies. Entry into a profession required years of training under a master. For orphaned boys, especially those taken in by hospitals or parishes, apprenticeship offered a path to adulthood with some structure and protection. but the reality was often harsher than the ideal. In 14th century England, under the Statute of Artificers passed in 1563 but built on earlier custom, parish officials were given authority to bind poor or orphaned children into apprenticeships. These contracts could last 7 to 10 years and were legally binding. Masters were expected to teach a trade and provide basic care, but enforcement was inconsistent. Many orphans ended up in workshops or fields where discipline was severe and conditions brutal. In London's Christ's Hospital, founded in 1552, but building on earlier Tudor reforms, orphaned boys were sent into apprenticeships by the age of 10. Girls, when accepted, were often placed in domestic service. Surviving records show that some boys were apprenticed to blacksmiths, weavers, or merchants. Others were sent to sea as cabin boys or into colonial ventures. The hospital kept ledgers documenting each placement, useful data for modern historians. But for the children, it meant a one-way exit. Elsewhere in Europe, similar systems developed. In 15th century Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti sent children into apprenticeships arranged by civic authorities. Contracts were drawn up, sometimes with stipulations for clothing or pocket money upon completion. But these terms depended on the goodwill and financial position of the master. Abuse, neglect, and overwork were common, particularly when the child had no surviving family to advocate for them. The church also played a role. Monasteries across Europe received orphaned boys and often trained them in manual tasks or religious duties. Some became lay brothers or scribes, but most labored in silence-tending fields, copying texts, or serving older monks. In exchange, they received shelter, religious instruction, and food. Discipline in monastic settings could be rigid and punishing. Yet for some, it was more stable than life in the streets. Charity was the stated motivation behind many of these arrangements, but economics was never far behind. Orphans represented a source of labor that didn't require wages. Municipal councils saw them as potential liabilities if left untrained or idle. Apprenticeship was a way to transfer that burden onto guilds and private citizens. For every orphan who mastered a trade and gained independence, many more faded into records as unnamed servants, laborers, or casualties of abuse. Their labor kept workshops running and households clean, but their lives were rarely documented beyond the initial contract. In theory, the system offered a second chance. In practice, it often delivered only survival, barely earned, and never guaranteed. In medieval Europe, orphaned girls faced a different and often more perilous reality than their male counterparts. Without legal guardians or dowries, they became some of the most vulnerable individuals in society. Their futures were shaped not only by poverty, but by gendered expectations and restrictions that left few options and little protection. Girls, without families, were often placed into domestic service by the age of 10. In cities like Paris, London, and Cologne, households of merchants, clergy, or minor nobility would take them in as maids, laundresses, or kitchen workers. These placements were presented as charity, but they rarely offered safety. Abuse, physical, sexual, or psychological, a known risk, especially in homes with no formal oversight. Female servants had virtually no legal recourse. If dismissed or accused of misconduct, they faced public shame and permanent exclusion from future employment. In some cases, orphaned girls were forced into marriage, often arranged by parish officials, charitable institutions, or surviving male relatives. Without a dowry, they were married off to much older men or those of lower social rank. The marriage served a practical function, transferring responsibility from the community to a husband, regardless of the girl's age or consent. In 13th and 14th century England, for example, poor girls were sometimes wed as early as 12, aligning with canon law, which set the legal marriage age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. There were darker routes, too. In the Mediterranean world, especially port cities like Genoa, Venice, and Barcelona, there is documented evidence of orphaned girls being trafficked. Some were sold into servitude across the Islamic world or within European domestic networks. Others ended up in brothels, where the boundary between survival and exploitation vanished entirely. Venice, by the 15th century, had passed laws to regulate and tax prostitution, and while it provided some structure, it did little to shield those forced into the trade. Orphans, lacking family, reputation, or means were easy targets. Religious institutions offered one of the few alternatives. Convents accepted some orphaned girls, especially those from urban centers, with charitable endowments. But entry was not always free. Girls needed a modest dowry or a sponsor. Once inside, life in the convent was tightly controlled. Prayer, silence, and labor. For some, it was a safe haven. For others, it was a form of lifelong confinement chosen by others. In Florence, the Santa Maria degli Angeli convent received orphaned girls from the Ospedale degli Innocenti, training them in embroidery and liturgical service. But there was little freedom to leave, and those who resisted monastic life had no alternatives. Legal and social frameworks rarely acknowledged the unique vulnerabilities of orphaned girls. Their fate depended heavily on location, available institutions, and sheer luck. Municipal governments and church bodies offered general protection for orphans, but failed to create gender-specific safeguards. Across medieval Europe, an orphaned girl's body became currency traded for labor, marriage, or stability. In public records, they appear as line items in dowry funds, as names in convent rolls, or as faceless statistics in mortality lists. Few left written testimonies. Most were absorbed into households, cloisters, or systems that erased their voices. Their experiences underscore how gender shaped not only social roles, but the very possibility of survival. In the growing cities of medieval Europe, the poorest districts pulsed with a rhythm of survival. Narrow streets, crowded with market stalls, overflowing refuse, and unregulated tenement housing became home to a hidden population: children without parents, without homes, and often without names. For orphaned boys and girls who fell outside the reach of foundling hospitals, monasteries, or charitable institutions, the streets offered no protection, only exposure. In 14th century London, city officials documented the increasing presence of unsupervised children living among the alleys near Cheapside, and parish wardens occasionally recorded attempts to house or relocate them, but many simply vanished between the cracks of civic responsibility. Surviving on scraps, begging at church doors, and trailing market carts for discarded food, these children quickly learned which gates stayed open and which beatings came without warning. Paris, by the late 13th century, faced a similar dilemma. Reports from the PRVT de Paris, the office overseeing law enforcement, include accounts of thefts by children operating in groups, often near Les Halles, the city's main food market. Pickpocketing and minor burglary were common among these youth gangs. Their ages ranged from 8 to 15. They were rarely named in official records. When caught, they were treated not as children in need of protection, but as criminals. Some were flogged, others imprisoned. A few disappeared into servitude. In Rome, papal authorities expressed concern. By the mid-15th century, over the number of fungi wandering children, particularly those loitering around the Vatican precincts or the Trastevere district. Some had escaped the overcrowded orphanages, where mortality rates were high. Others had never entered the system at all. The Holy See occasionally issued alms for their care, but street children remained, an enduring and largely unsolved problem. The boundary between orphan and delinquent was poorly defined. Medieval legal codes, particularly in England and France, did not recognize childhood as a protected category. Criminal liability could begin at age 7. A child found stealing bread or a purse could be tried, punished, and incarcerated alongside adults. In some cases, they were pressed into forced labor or military service. There were no probation systems, no juvenile protections. Informal communities developed among street orphans. Older children taught younger ones how to evade guards, beg strategically, or gain favor with tavern owners. In some cities, they formed loosely organized gangs. In Bruges and Ghent, municipal records describe incidents of coordinated theft involving youth groups. In Milan, the city statutes of the early 1400s list specific prohibitions against wandering children who obstruct the trade lanes or interfere with the processions. Church institutions occasionally intervened, but capacity was limited. Sometimes offered food or shelter, but only to a fraction of the street population. Confraternities lay, religious groups, organized charitable distributions during holy festivals, temporarily lifting the burden but never solving it. The reality was simple. Urban growth had outpaced the medieval systems of care. For street orphans, the city itself became a test of endurance. Few left traces behind. Their stories, if recorded at all, appear in court rolls, parish ledgers, or sudden absences noted by charitable clerks. In the margins of medieval urban life, these children lived between visibility and erasion, ever fully belonging, and rarely rescued. In medieval Europe, religion shaped not just belief, but every social institution, including how society responded to orphaned and abandoned children. The Church was both the central moral authority and the largest provider of organized care. Its doctrine, however, did not present a single unified view of orphans. Instead, it projected a set of tensions between innocence and sin, between divine will and human responsibility. At the core of medieval Christian theology was the concept of original sin. Every child, orphan or not, was believed to be born into spiritual corruption inherited from Adam and Eve. Baptism offered redemption, but until that sacrament was performed, the child remained vulnerable, not just physically, but spiritually. Unbaptized children who died were denied burial in consecrated ground. For foundlings abandoned anonymously, this created urgent complications. Monasteries and hospitals prioritized rapid baptism, sometimes within hours of discovery, to ensure the child's soul would be received by God if death followed, which it often did. Orphanhood itself was sometimes interpreted as a consequence of sin, not the child's, but the parents'. In sermons, clerical figures occasionally framed the deaths of parents as divine punishment for moral failings. Children left behind were, in this view, bearers of a family's shame. This theological framing could influence how a community responded. Compassion was not universal. In some cases, abandonment was treated with suspiciousness if the child appeared to be born out of wedlock. Illegitimacy carried deep stigma. Canon law allowed for the excommunication of mothers who abandoned illegitimate children, and their offspring were often denied inheritance and sometimes even basic rights. Yet within the same theological framework, orphans could also be seen as embodiments of Christian suffering innocence tested by God. This interpretation aligned with the Church's emphasis on charity as a spiritual obligation. Caring for orphans, especially through monastic orders, was seen as a path to salvation. Saint Basil the Great, writing in the 4th century, had urged the creation of orphanages as acts of Christian duty. By the 12th and 13th centuries, this sentiment had taken institutional form across Europe. Religious brotherhoods, especially in Italy and Spain, organized confraternities to support orphan care. In Florence, the Compagnia della Misericordia was one of several lay groups that funded the Ospedale degli Innocenti. Their mission was framed explicitly as service to Christ through service to the vulnerable. The Book of James, pure religion, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, was cited frequently in support. Still, even within these acts of charity, spiritual salvation often outweighed material concern. Orphanages were designed to correct and discipline as much as to care. Children were raised in environments structured around prayer, obedience, and humility. Their future roles were determined by the religious or economic logic of the institution, not by their individual needs. The theological weight of orphanhood was never neutral. It oscillated between redemption and judgment, purity and punishment, and in that ambiguity, the medieval orphan occupied a space that was both cared for and scrutinized, protected by divine command, yet never fully free from the burden of inherited sin. In the margins of medieval Europe's written memory, the lives of orphaned children flicker briefly then vanish. They appear in fragments: baptismal records with no parent listed, parish ledgers noting a child left at the door, or monastic account books recording expenditures for food, cloth, and burial. Most were not named. Many weren't even counted. In Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti preserved a unique category of these traces. Beginning in the mid-15th century, nurses recorded identifying tokens left with infants' buttons, scraps of fabric, coins split in half. These were not sentimental gestures. They were crude identifiers, meant to signal the possibility of future reclamation. But in practice, reunions were rare. The tokens remained catalogued in hospital archives, long after the names attached to them had been forgotten. Some orphanages scratched names or initials into stone or plaster rudimentary attempts at recognition. At institutions like the Hôpital des Enfants Trouves in Paris, founded later in the 17th century but based on medieval precedents, records of foundlings became more structured. Yet even there, most entries amounted to no more than anonymous male child, approximate age 3 days. Earlier medieval records were even thinner. In many cities, street orphans never entered any register at all. In England, ecclesiastical courts occasionally mentioned base-born or abandoned children in inheritance disputes, particularly when distant kin tried to claim property after the parents' deaths. In such cases, the child's existence became a legal inconvenience, recorded not for compassion, but to determine exclusion. Some boys appear in apprenticeship roles, tied to trades under municipal or parish oversight. Others are listed in court proceedings, accused of theft or vagrancy, tried and punished before reaching full adolescence. Few stories extend beyond a single entry: a baptism, a fine, a burial. In London's Christ's Hospital, founded in 1552 but echoing earlier medieval structures, a handful of names survive in student registers: orphans who lived long enough to be apprenticed or sent to sea. But these are exceptions. Most records end in silence. Deaths went unregistered. Burials were performed without headstones. Institutions, already strained by famine, plague, or war, did not track what they could not manage. The scale of loss, human, historical, is immeasurable. What remains is not narrative, but residue. And that absence reveals a society's limits. Medieval Europe built cathedrals that took centuries to complete, penned chronicles of kings and crusades, and illuminated sacred texts with gold leaf. But for its most vulnerable children, it left behind little more than initials in faded ink and scraps of linen folded in forgotten ledgers. Their lives ask a question still unanswered: what does it mean for a society to forget its most dependent members? And what responsibility do later generations bear in remembering what was meant to be erased? The orphan of the Middle Ages did not leave a legacy of monuments, but their disappearance, so total, so routine, casts a long shadow, a record, not of who they were, but of who we allowed them to become.